And we're back. We left off in our last podcast talking about Iberian unification and exactly how Portugal and Spain did this. And this is what it looks like, just so you know. The ununified Spain, Portugal is slowly but surely getting there, and eventually Spain would make it too. Now we're going to move on and talk about the rise of European universities. Again, the Crusades. Look for the silver lining, guys. Because of the Crusades, after 1100, Western Europeans gained access to those Greek and Arabic texts and the works on science, philosophy, and medicine. Because as you guys know, they were saved during the rise of the caliphates, the Umayyads and the Abbasids, from being lost forever, being translated into Arabic, and then from Arabic back into Latin. Would not want to be translating all of that. Can barely get through my Intro to Spanish textbook. But as knowledge progresses, universities begin in Paris, France, and Bologna. Latin was the language of education and the administration of church and state. So if you were the ruler of a kingdom, didn't matter that you spoke English, somebody else spoke Spanish, there was French, there was German. It didn't matter because you also spoke Latin. And this is why all of those texts are translated into Latin. Education was based on the curriculum of liberal arts, which consisted of 3 levels of study. But here's the thing, guys. Books are expensive. It took a very long time to produce because the printing press does not yet exist. Quite often, books are actually copied by hand. There is no such thing as copyright violations. Often because books cost so much and took so long to make, teachers at universities worked slowly through a book, and they might even spend 1 or 2 years on a single book. Bologna became the place to be if you wanted to study law. Greek texts were reintroduced, we know for sure, after 1100, but they're going to have trouble reaching the masses until Gutenberg is actually able to create the printing press. The type of text that the song we're using, that movable type in the metal frame, that knowledge didn't make it to the European world. At least not by 1150. Pardon me. Some scholars welcomed the Islamic innovations because in addition to texts being reintroduced, paper is also introduced to Western Europe. And even though some people were excited about the new technology and the knowledge coming from the Islamic world, a lot of people looked down on it because they weren't Christian ideas. Paris and Bologna were the first and most important of the early universities. Paris was about twice the size of Bologna. They had a population of about 80,000. Modern university degrees reflect the levels of membership in the guilds. Students had power in the university towns because they formed a very large body of consumers. In addition, you also have universities forming in England, France, Germany, and parts of Eastern Europe. In the middle of the 14th century, there's a marked increase in the pace of intellectual and artistic life. Theology becomes a very prominent discipline in this period because theologians sought to synthesize the rational philosophy of the Greeks with the Christian faith in the Latin West. So this intellectual movement is called scholasticism. You also have, again, focusing on artistic life and intellectual life, the rebirth, the recreation, or the Renaissance. We will spend a great deal of time later talking about various artists in the Renaissance. Islamic and Chinese schools educated many students, but unlike European universities, they didn't grant degrees. Most students at European universities, though, didn't even finish their degrees. So really, it didn't matter. Churches and monasteries directly benefited from increased agricultural yields. There was no unified church in medieval Europe, and people were expected to pay a tithe or 10% of their income to the church. And this includes some members of the church. I'm talking about nuns and monks. There were 2 types of clergy. You had secular clergy, which were priests who were out in the world. You also had regular clergy, which were the monks who followed certain rules and generally lived away from society. Priests were expected to perform the sacraments of baptism, confirmation, marriage, communion, and funerals. Monks spend their days studying religious texts. They also write, create prayers, do work for the poor. Leo IX tried to reform the papacy after a crisis in 1046 led to reforms of the church. Something that definitely caught me by surprise, especially having been raised Catholic, was that it actually wasn't required that priests not marry and remain celibate. It actually wasn't a universally recognized requirement of the priesthood, and it wouldn't be for years. Pope Gregory the Seventh, Pope Gregory the Seventh, guys, he's going to reign as Pope from 1073 to 1085. He issues what's called the 27 Declarations of Papal Supremacy. This is where the term papal infallibility comes from. It's a dogma of the Catholic Church that states, in virtue of the promise of Jesus to Peter, the Pope is preserved from the possibility of error when, and this is a quote, in the exercise of his office as shepherd and teacher of all Christians, in virtue of his supreme apostolic authority, he defines a doctrine concerning faith or morals to be held by the whole church. Basically, what this led to was that the Pope was in charge of all of the souls and therefore could tell them what to do or what not to do. And this includes kings. And this is going to become quite a problem later on when you have conflict between church and state. In 1215, Pope Innocent III convened the Fourth Lateran Council, and he ends up passing I believe it's 14 different passages, and these include faith, heresy, order and discipline, morality, appointments and elections, legal procedures, rules on marriage, excommunication, and these are quite long, quite detailed. You can actually read them. The document, it does still exist. So if you're interested, take a look at it. It breaks it down what the rules are. And one that really caught me by surprise was marriage. In the Catholic Church, if a marriage does not take place within the Catholic Church, it's not recognized. So a friend of mine was Catholic. Her fiance was not. And they got married outside of the Catholic Church because since he wasn't Catholic, he actually couldn't get married in the Catholic Church. After they were married, they actually went to classes and then had a separate ceremony after he was baptized a Catholic to be remarried in the Catholic Church. And that's actually described in Pope Innocent III's rules. Let's talk about monks for a minute. Some monks in the 12th century rejected the need to live in community with other monks on their own incomes. So you have Francis of Assisi, who lived from about 1181 to 1216. He abandoned his very, very wealthy merchant family to become a begging monk and establishes the Order of the Franciscans, and they attracted quite a few followers. In 1215, Saint Dominic, who lived from 1170 to 1221, founded the Order of the Friars Preachers, which is where you get the Dominican monks. And one of the most famous would be Thomas Aquinas, 1224 to 1274. He's a Dominican and probably the most famous of all scholastic thinkers. So let's talk about nobles, monarchs, and the church. In England, the Norman conquest of 1066 had consolidated and had centralized royal power, but the kings continued to find their power limited by the Pope, again, going back to the passage by Pope Gregory VII on papal infallibility. I told you guys it's going to cause a problem later on. The kings have quite a bit of conflict because they have to recognize the fact that the Pope has more power over their kingdom than they as kings do. We'll talk more about that later on. Kings are also limited by the power of the nobles, especially English nobles. And the first document that will ever limit a king's power is the Magna Carta, and it forces the king to recognize the hereditary rights of nobles and that nobles have certain rights and privileges. Mind you, this is only for the nobles. It's not for, the common man, women. Yeah. Anyway, the 13th century European states were ruled by rather weak monarchs. And in addition to being limited by the nobles, they have very modest treasuries. The regional nobility owns quite a bit of the land, and the independent towns are controlled by churches. But two changes in weaponry begin to change everything. And it changes the economic position of the noble knights. And first, you have the development of firearms. You also have the armor piercing crossbow. So that armor is not going to keep you safe if one of those arrows comes flying at you. One of the first kings to attempt to reduce the power is King Philip the Fair of France. Say that 12 times fast, please. And he attempts to reduce the power of the church when he arrested the Pope and had a new French Pope installed at Avignon. Monarchs still faced resistance, especially from the stronger vassals. And this is where you have the Great Western Schism. Yes, the second one. First, you had the East-West. Now you have the Great Western Schism from 1378 to 1417. And this is also called the Papal Schism. It's a split within the Roman Catholic Church. Three men simultaneously claimed to be the true pope. And this was driven by politics rather than any theological disagreement. The schism ends with the Council of Constance, which goes from 1414 to 1418. The 100 Years' War. It pitted France against England. And the first kings, guys, this is the 100 Years' War. So the first kings involved are Edward III, England, and Philip VI of France. And it begins when Edward III claims the French throne for himself. That is Edward III of England. And the war was fought with new military technology. Crossbows, longbows, pikes for pulling knights off their horse. I don't even want to think about that one. And firearms, including the improved cannon. But the French, who had quite superior cannons, destroyed the castles of England and their allies. And their army was also stronger. It was rallied by, this is the kicker, guys, a woman named Joan of Arc. She finally defeats the English, but she is eventually captured and then burnt at the stake on charges of heresy. The war left the French monarchy in a stronger position than before. The advent of new military technology, cannon, and handheld firearms meant that the castle and the knights were outdated. From the 15th century onward, monarchs depended on professional standing armies of bowmen, pikemen, musketeers, and artillery units. You should also know that the wars were fought entirely on French soil. You've got House of Plantagenet versus the House of Valois. So here we have a map detailing who has what. And continuing towards the very end. France is able to reclaim their territory. We'll wrap it up with the new monarchs that emerged after the 100 Years' War had stronger central governments, more stable national boundaries, and stronger representative institutions. So you actually do have the formation of Parliament, or the King's Council, beginning. Both the English and the French monarchs consolidated their control over nobles. The new monarchs had to find new sources of revenue to pay for these standing armies. To do that, they began taxing land, merchants, and the church. And by the end of the 15th century, there's a definite shift in power away from the nobility and the church towards the monarchs. Now, mind you, if the Pope says jump, you still say how high. But the king has more power over his own kingdom than ever before. And this process is not nearly complete, by the way. This is his ongoing evolution. Monarchs were still hemmed in by the nobles, by the church, and the Parliament in England, the Estates General in France. To wrap up again, sorry guys, one last one about civic life. So just in talking about civic life, some European cities were city-states, as you guys know. Others enjoy autonomy from local nobles. European cities offered their citizens more freedom and social mobility. Most of Europe's Jews lived in these cities, and they were subject to persecution everywhere but Rome. They were also blamed for disasters like the Black Death, and as I told you guys before, they were actually expelled from Spain. Guilds regulated the practice of and access to trades. Women generally couldn't partake in guilds, but they did work in unskilled, non guild jobs in the textile industry, as well as the food and beverage trades. The growth in commerce gave rise to bankers like the Medicis of Florence. Told you guys we'd come back to Florence, and the Fugers of Augsburg. And they handled financial transactions for merchants, the church, and royalty of Europe. Because the church prohibited money lending, if you will, many money lenders were actually Jews, and Christian bankers got around the prohibition of this practice through asking for gifts instead of interest. So here's the thing, if you loan somebody money, according to the church, you get that money back, and that's the end of it. But generally, if you give a loan to somebody, you would like some interest on that loan. Church says you can't do that. So to get around that, here's a loan, and you'll give me a gift in return. So no interest, but when you pay back my money, I expect something in return, like a nice golden cup or a cow, perhaps. And the church called this usury. Despite these advances in cities, there's still basic facilities that are lacking, like public health, hygiene, plumbing. And this is rather opposite of cities in the Roman times or even the Islamic cities that were prospering during the same time period. Now we're done. So when we pick up next podcast, we're focusing on the Renaissance with the Medicis, godfathers of the Renaissance. By the way, a great PBS documentary. Send me those emails, guys, if you got any questions, and have a great night. Cheers.